When you study history, there is this expectation of cause and effect.
Right, like a straight line.
Exactly. You look at an event and you can kind of trace it back to a very specific logical origin point. Like a political treaty is signed, and then, I don't know, a decade later, you watch the borders change on a map.
Yeah, it's measurable.
Right. You point at the timeline and just say, there it is. But when you step into the world of religion specifically, the history of Christianity and violence, suddenly that neat linear timeline just absolutely
Oh,
shatters.
completely.
I mean, we are looking at this historical and moral landscape that is just stained with blood and filled with these profound contradictions.
It is honestly the absolute definition of a historical paradox.
It really is.
Yeah.
So today we are opening up a set of notes that outline a Catholic response to, well, one of history's heaviest, most enduring critiques.
Yeah.
And if you are listening to this deep dive, you're probably someone who wants to understand the foundational ideas that shape our world, without the fluff.
About the talking points.
Exactly. So we are examining a specific source text today that details the official Catholic defense regarding this intense intersection of Christianity and violence.
But before we really move into the material, we need to establish a very clear boundary for you, the listener.
Yes, crucial point.
We are not here to debate theology. We're not here to endorse a religion. And we certainly are not taking a side in some historical religious debate.
Right, we're just your guides.
Exactly. Our role is strictly to be your guides. We are going to objectively unpack the exact architecture of the argument laid out in these notes.
Because we really want to dissect how the source material constructs its defense against a very specific, massive accusation. So let's put that accusation on the table right now.
Let's do it.
The core objection our text deals with today is basically this. What about the Crusades, the Inquisition, and all the violence done in the name of Christianity?
That's the big one.
It's huge. The text acknowledges that people look at these events and conclude that, well, Christianity causes violence, that religion is fundamentally dangerous, and that the church essentially has blood on its hands.
And this critique carries so much weight because, it isn't an abstract theoretical philosophy debate.
Right, it's real life.
Exactly. It points to real, documented historical events that lead rational people to look at the institution and conclude it's inherently dangerous. So, to understand the defense presented in the text, we have to look at the primary distinction it makes right out of the gate.
Okay, what is that distinction?
Well, the entire Catholic response outlined here hinges on separating two things. On one side, the founder's original teaching, and on the other, the subsequent misuse of his name by followers later in history.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we want to evaluate the claim that Christianity is inherently violent, we have to look at the source code, right?
Right, the blueprint.
We have to look at what the founder actually commanded. And the text brings up two very explicit scriptural mandates. First, it points to Matthew 5.44, which says, "But I say to you, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who persecute and calumniate you."
Which is a tough sell.
To say the least. And then it pairs that with Matthew 26.52, where Jesus says, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword."
What's fascinating here is how the source material actually characterizes these verses. It emphasizes that these are not, ambiguous suggestions.
Like they aren't just good advice.
Right, and they aren't poetic metaphors either.
Yeah.
The text defines them as explicit, radically nonviolent commands. The core tenets established here are forgiveness, love of enemies, self-sacrifice, and mercy.
And we really need to contextualize how radical that actually was. Because, in the first century Roman occupation of Judea, the prevailing mood among many of Jesus's contemporaries was violent revolution.
Oh, absolutely. It was a pressure cooker.
Right. You had factions like the Zealots who believed the only religious and moral response to Roman oppression was armed insurrection. So into that geopolitical powder keg, the founder drops the command to love your enemies.
Yeah, it's kind of wild when you think about it.
He is essentially telling a subjugated people to love the occupying Roman soldiers. That is a staggering psychological and sociological demand.
It really is. And the notes argue that this was a complete paradigm shift in the understanding of power. Because in the ancient world, power was universally understood as, well, the ability to exert physical dominance over your enemies.
Kill or be killed.
Exactly. But the text points out that these commands introduced a mechanism where power is completely inverted, It becomes the willingness to absorb suffering rather than inflict it.
Okay, but reading this beautiful philosophy in a quiet room is one thing. Doing it is another.
Right.
So I want to push back on the text premise here, and it's something I really want you, the listener, to consider. Any movement can have a pristine founding document. But the real test of a philosophy is what happens when the people following it are actually threatened with annihilation. Does the text give us evidence of how this nonviolent architecture held up in the real world when the Roman Empire actually decided to crush them? Like, did they actually put the sword away?
That's the key question. And the text answers that by pointing directly to the first 300 years of the movement. According to the source, the first Christians operated as a community of nonviolent martyrs.
Wow.
Yeah. They were heavily persecuted, imprisoned, and executed by the state. The text explicitly states that they did not conquer by force, nor did they mount armed rebellions against the Roman authorities that were oppressing them.
So they literally lived the source code out.
They did.
The nonviolence wasn't just like a theory, it was their literal historical survival strategy, or rather, I guess, their dying strategy for 3 whole centuries.
And the text names 2 specific historical figures to really illustrate the mechanics of this nonviolent resistance. First, Justin Martyr. He was a 2nd century philosopher who converted to Christianity. Now, when he was brought before the Roman prefect, he didn't fight back physically. Instead, he used Roman philosophical frameworks to defend the faith intellectually.
Oh, so he tried to reason with them.
Exactly. The text highlights him because he exhausted every peaceful intellectual avenue to explain that the religion was harmless to the state. And when the state demanded he renounce his beliefs anyway, he just accepted execution.
He used logic, and when logic failed against the sword, he chose the blade over taking up his own.
Right.
That's intense. Who is the second figure the text brings up?
Polycarp of Smyrna. He was an elderly bishop in the 2nd century. The account of his martyrdom is actually one of the earliest preserved documents outside the New Testament.
Really?
Yeah. And the Roman proconsul actually pitied Polycarp because of his old age. He practically begged him to simply swear by the genius of Caesar and curse Christ just to save his own life.
Just say the words and you can go free.
Exactly. But Polycarp refused. He stated he had served his king for 86 years without betrayal, and he was subsequently burned at the stake.
It's kind of crazy to think about the sociological mechanism at play here. By refusing to meet violence with violence, these early followers created this massive cognitive dissonance within the Roman Empire.
So absolutely.
Like, the crowds came to the Colosseum to watch rebels be executed, but instead they saw people peacefully singing or praying for their executioners. The thematic takeaway from the text here is that the early spread of the religion was achieved through witness, sacrifice, and martyrdom.
Or, to use the exact phrasing from the notes, Christianity spread not by the sword, but by the cross.
Wow, okay.
And the source argues that this 300-year period of sustained institutional nonviolence proves that the original code of the religion was entirely devoid of violent conquest. It was a completely decentralized movement that survived precisely because it refused to engage in the military structures of the time.
That paints a very vivid, undeniable picture of the original blueprint, a strictly nonviolent, self-sacrificing community. But obviously, history doesn't stay in the first 300 years.
No, it definitely does not.
Right. So if the original blueprint was that fiercely nonviolent, how does a text explain the massive bloody violence committed by believers later on? We have to move from this ideal, peaceful start to the flawed human execution of it.
And that transition brings us to the Central Catholic response, according to our source material. The text argues that when Christians use violence, they are failing Christ.
Failing him completely.
Exactly. Unjust violence is framed as absolute disobedience. The notes literally equate cruelty to sin, and they call oppression a direct rejection of Christ's teaching.
So the argument is that violence done in the name of the religion actually contradicts the religion's explicit commands.
Yes. And to back this up, the text introduces another piece of scripture, Romans 12:1, which says, "Do not defend yourselves, most beloved, but give place unto wrath. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord."
So what does this all mean? The psychological function of that verse is actually really fascinating.
How so?
Well, historically, human societies operate on blood feuds and cyclical retaliation, right? Like, if you hurt my family, I hurt yours, and it just never ends.
An eye for an eye.
Exactly. By explicitly delegating vengeance to God, the text is introducing this massive psychological release valve for human anger. It tells the follower, you do not have the jurisdiction to exact revenge.
Which means if a follower commits an unjust, vengeful act,
Hmm.
they aren't doing it because of the religion. They are doing it by actively stripping God of that jurisdiction and taking it for themselves.
Right.
They are in direct contradiction to the text.
You know, the source uses a modern analogy here to help us grasp this logical distinction. It says, if a person misuses medicine to harm others, we don't conclude that medicine is evil.
Right.
We conclude that that person abused something good. It completely separates the nature of the tool from the intent of the user. Like, if a staunch vegan is caught secretly eating a steak, it doesn't prove that veganism is a scam or that the diet is fake, you know?
Yeah, it just proves that the individual completely failed to uphold the standard they claimed to believe.
Exactly.
And it attempts to show that the existence of misuse or abuse proves a failure to follow the standard, not the collapse of the standard itself.
Okay, but I want to stop here and offer some serious pushback.
Sure, go ahead.
The medicine analogy works perfectly for an individual. If a single nurse steals medicine and poisons someone, sure, we blame the rogue nurse. But we aren't just talking about individual sinners in history.
No.
We are talking about the church as a massive institution. If a hospital systematically poisons its patients for hundreds of years and the board of directors signs off on it, you don't just blame the individual doctors. You blame the hospital's entire protocol. So how does the text reconcile institutional state-sponsored violence with this idea of just individual failure?
This raises an incredibly important question, and the source text navigates it by insisting that the rules of the hospital, to use your extension of the analogy, never actually changed.
Okay.
The theological tenets, the scriptures, the commands to love enemies, they remained identical and unchanged in the texts throughout history.
But something definitely changed.
Yes. What changed was that the individuals running the institution became entangled with secular temporal state power. The text argues that when the church leaders acted as political monarchs, they succumbed to the corrupting mechanisms of political survival. They started utilizing the methods of the state rather than the methods of the gospel.
Okay, so the argument is that the standard of radical love remained the official, unalterable code, but the human execution of that code was catastrophically distorted by the acquisition of earthly power.
Yes, exactly. The text essentially asks us to judge the religion by its unchanging philosophical and theological core, rather than by the epochs where its leaders hypocritically abandoned that core just to play geopolitics.
Wow. We have to move from the theory of failure to the specific historical case studies our source brings up.
We definitely do.
Because we can't just talk about institutional entanglement abstractly. We have to look at the Crusades and the Inquisition.
The big two.
Right. Because in popular culture, the Crusades are presented as the ultimate proof of unprovoked, greedy Christian aggression. A holy war purely for territorial conquest and wealth.
And the text argues that the popular cultural narrative is a significant historical oversimplification.
So?
It breaks down several specific factors that drove the Crusades, asking us to zoom in on the messiness of history. First, it defines them primarily as a defense of Christian lands and a direct response to centuries of prior invasion.
Let's explain the mechanism of that defense, because the Crusades didn't just happen out of nowhere on a random Tuesday in 1095.
Right, they didn't happen in a vacuum.
Exactly. By the time Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, Islamic empires had spent the previous 400 years rapidly expanding through military conquest, taking over massive territories that were historically Christian, including the Holy Land, North Africa, and parts of Spain.
And the precipitating event that the text's defense argument relies on was the severe threat to the Byzantine Empire in the east. The Seljuk Turks were advancing, which culminated in massive defeats for the Byzantines.
So they asked for help.
Right. They appealed to the West, to the Pope, for military aid to stop the complete collapse of their civilization. So the text points out that this was, in its origin, a defensive geopolitical maneuver against an expanding empire.
Second, the notes highlight that the Crusades were driven by heavy political and economic factors, not just religious fervor. We have to look at the economic structure of Europe at the time.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle.
You had the system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited all the family's land and wealth, which left an entire generation of heavily armed, highly trained second and third sons with no land, no money, and a massive propensity for violence, basically terrorizing the European countryside.
Exactly. And directing that aggressive, landless military class outward toward a foreign enemy served a massive domestic political purpose for European leaders.
It got rid of the problem.
Yes, it exported their internal violence. Furthermore, there were enormous economic incentives regarding control of the really lucrative trade routes to the east.
Third, the text explicitly states the Crusades were fueled by mixed motives, and I quote, some noble, some sinful. You had people who genuinely believed they were undertaking a spiritually perilous journey to protect pilgrims who were being slaughtered on their way to Jerusalem.
Right.
And on the other hand, you had warlords who just wanted to carve out a kingdom for themselves in the Levant and get incredibly rich.
And the goal of the text here is not to say the Crusades were perfectly justified holy wars.
Yeah.
The goal is to dismantle the idea that they were just some spontaneous outburst of religious bigotry. They were a deeply complex geopolitical response, totally tangled up with economics, self-defense, and human greed.
Okay, but if the Crusades were partly geopolitical defense, that still doesn't explain violence turned inward against the church's own citizens.
Yeah, the Inquisition.
We have to look at the Inquisition, because the imagery there is visceral. Torture chambers, shadowy tribunals, people being burned at the stake just for having the wrong thoughts. How does the text possibly address that?
Well, the text absolutely acknowledges that the Inquisition involved real abuses. It does not attempt to wipe the historical record clean.
Okay, that's important.
Very important. However, it argues that the historical reality was vastly different from the popular dramatized myths we see in movies. According to the notes, the Inquisition was actually more legally structured than many secular courts of the time.
Let's compare those mechanisms directly. Because in the medieval period, if you were accused of a crime in a secular temporal court, the legal mechanisms were often just horrific.
Oh, they were brutal.
You had trial by ordeal. They might throw you into a river bound by ropes. If you floated, the water was rejecting you because you were guilty.
And if you sank...
If you sank, you were innocent, though, you might drown.
Right.
Or they would make you hold a red-hot iron, and if your wound became infected days later, it proved your guilt. It was essentially superstition masquerading as law, heavily influenced by mob rule.
In contrast, the text points out that the Inquisition, while obviously dealing with matters of heresy, introduced rigorous legal structures that we would actually recognize today as foundational to modern jurisprudence.
Wait, really? Like what?
It required a burden of proof.
Right.
It required corroborating witnesses. An accused person could actually provide a list of their known enemies to the inquisitor, and if a witness against them was on that list, their testimony was thrown out.
Why, so they couldn't just frame you?
Exactly. They actually kept meticulous written records of testimonies, and a significant number of cases ended in acquittals or penances that did not involve any physical harm.
Yeah.
The text claims it was often far less brutal than the popular myths suggest, primarily because its initial purpose was to stop the secular authorities from just executing suspected heretics via mob violence.
Ah.
The church wanted a tribunal to determine who was actually a heretic, rather than just letting the mob decide.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is vital to clarify what the source text is doing with this historical data. It explicitly states, this does not excuse wrongdoing.
Right.
The text is not apologizing for the fact that people were executed. It is pointing out that history is rarely as simple as a black and white narrative of pure religious evil versus secular innocence. The Inquisition brought a legal framework to a society that was previously relying on superstition and mob justice.
Exactly.
But I am going to play devil's advocate again.
Please do.
Because even if the history is complex, and even if the Crusades were geopolitical, and even if the Inquisition had legal structures requiring burden of proof, the violence still happened.
Yes.
Torture was still utilized. Executions were still handed over to the secular arm. Blood was still spilled in the name of the institution. So does the modern church just shrug its shoulders, point to the Middle Ages and say, well, history is complicated? Or are there actual codified boundaries now? Like, has the institution corrected its protocol?
The source material addresses that exact concern by shifting from the messiness of medieval history to the highly codified rules of the modern church. It introduces the Catechism of the Catholic Church, often referred to as the CCC.
Right.
And it uses it to show exactly where the moral lines are drawn today regarding violence and justice.
For you listening, we should quickly define what the Catechism actually is. It isn't just a loose collection of essays. Promulgated in its current form in the 1990s under Pope John Paul II, it is the official authoritative reference text for Catholic doctrine.
It's the rule book.
Exactly. It explicitly defines the theological and moral boundaries for the global church. So what are the specific rules our text cites?
The text gives us two specific citations to illustrate the modern boundaries. First, CCC 2302. This
Oh,
article addresses the internal motivation for violence.
okay.
It states that anger is a desire for revenge. Furthermore, it explicitly dictates that a deliberate desire to kill or seriously wound a neighbor is gravely against charity.
That targets the psychological intent. If
Yeah.
your goal is to cause harm out of revenge, you are violating the core principle of the religion. You are in a state of grave sin. What is the second citation?
The second is CCC 2309, which deals with institutional or state violence. It outlines that military force for legitimate defense requires rigorous consideration and is subject to incredibly strict conditions.
So, like just war theory, basically.
Exactly. It's drawing on the long tradition of just war theory.
It essentially says that a state cannot go to war just to acquire resources or territory. The damage inflicted by the aggressor must be lasting, grave, and certain.
Right. And all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. And the use of arms must not produce evils graver than the evil to be eliminated.
The text presents a profound tension here. On one hand, it reaffirms the strict limits against violence and the absolute prohibition of revenge. On the other hand, it acknowledges the tragic reality of human existence by permitting legitimate self-defense.
Yes, it teaches both the primacy of peace and the necessity of legitimate defense.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The overarching point the text makes is that violence is never, ever casually justified. The moral limits are rigidly defined, and peace is always ultimately the goal.
Right.
But having addressed the historical Christian failings and the official rules of the Catechism, the text suddenly pans the camera way back. It looks at the entirety of human history, particularly the 20th century, and it asks a probing, uncomfortable question. What about atheistic violence?
This is a huge shift, and the notes point out that this is an angle frequently ignored in these debates. When critics claim that religion is the primary cause of war and violence, they completely overlook the massive, unprecedented scale of bloodshed that occurred under explicitly atheistic secular regimes in recent history.
The text specifically lists three examples from the 20th century: the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and Nazi Germany.
Wow.
And it makes a crucial parenthetical note that Nazi Germany explicitly rejected core Christian moral teaching, favoring a social Darwinist view of racial supremacy.
We really need to examine the mechanism of what happened under these regimes. Under Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China, you had state ideologies based on Marxist-Leninism, which is fundamentally materialist and officially atheistic.
Right. Religion was seen as the opiate of the masses.
Exactly, and a direct threat to the supremacy of the state. Under these regimes, tens of millions of people were systematically starved, executed, and sent to gulags.
And none of that violence was driven by Christian theology. In fact, it was driven by ideologies that explicitly sought to eradicate religious belief. Now, we need to be very careful here to accurately represent the text, because we are not here to wage an ideological war against atheism.
No, absolutely not. And the text explicitly states that this data does not mean atheism causes violence. It is not just flipping the accusation around to say atheists are the real violent ones.
Right. Rather, it uses these 20th century examples to prove a vital philosophical point. Violence is a human problem, not uniquely a religious one. If you look at the mechanism of history, taking religion away didn't stop violence.
It didn't even slow it down.
No. In the case of the 20th century, removing religion coincided with violence scaling up to unprecedented industrial levels.
And the philosophical argument the text makes here is that when a society removes a transcendent moral arbiter, a God who commands love and sets limits on behavior, the state itself becomes the highest authority.
That's dangerous.
Extremely. Because when the state is the highest authority, there is no higher moral appeal to protect the individual from the state's utilitarian goals.
So if religion wasn't the root cause of historical violence, what is? The text concludes that the real issue, the true engine of human destruction, is the human heart.
It is a profound diagnosis of the human condition. It suggests that whether a person is holding a Bible, a political manifesto, a scientific treatise, or nothing at all, if their heart is corrupt, they will find an ideological framework to justify violence.
Which brings us to the final phase of the argument presented in our notes. If the human heart is the root of the violence we've seen, what does it look like when the human heart actually successfully follows the standard of radical love that we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive?
And the notes argue that to evaluate Christianity fairly, we can not only look at the times followers failed the standard.
Right.
We must also evaluate the positive impact, what the text calls the fruits of the authentic standard.
The text points to a vast institutional legacy of care. It lists the establishment of hospitals, the founding of universities, massive global charity networks, the foundational teaching of human dignity, the driving force behind abolition movements, and the systemic care for the poor.
Let's look at the mechanism behind that. In the ancient Roman world, if a plague broke out, the wealthy and powerful fled the cities.
They just left.
Yeah, they abandoned everyone. It was the early Christians who stayed behind to nurse the sick, often dying in the process, because their theology taught them that every single human being, regardless of social status, possessed inherent dignity as an image of God.
Wow.
And that theological concept of human dignity is the direct mechanism that eventually built the hospital systems and drove the abolition of slavery.
To ground these massive concepts, the text zeroes in on two specific historical figures from the modern era. Who is the first?
The first is Teresa of Calcutta. The text highlights her specifically for her life's work serving the poorest of the poor in India.
And we really need to explain the mechanism of her work because she didn't just write checks to charities.
No, she was on the ground.
She went into the slums, into places of total destitution, disease, and despair. She picked up people who were literally dying in the gutters, people that society had completely abandoned as untouchable, and she brought them into her clinic so they could die with dignity, feeling loved.
Incredible.
It is a staggering display of the radical self-sacrifice commanded in the original blueprint.
And the second figure the text provides is Maximilian Kolbe. The notes highlight that he gave his own life in the Auschwitz concentration camp to save another man.
We need to slow down and really look at the scene the text is invoking here. We are talking about Auschwitz.
Yeah.
It is arguably the darkest, most concentrated expression of violent human evil in history. A prisoner had escaped, and as a reprisal, the Nazi guards selected 10 men at random to be sent to the starvation bunker in Block 11. One of the men selected, Franciszek Gajowniczek, cried out for his wife and children.
And in that moment of absolute terror, Maximilian Kolbe, a Catholic priest, stepped out of line. He approached the commandant and volunteered to take Gajowniczek's place.
And they let him.
The guards actually accepted the exchange. Kolbe was sent to the starvation bunker, where he spent his final weeks leading the other condemned men in prayer and singing hymns, completely transforming the psychological atmosphere of the bunker until he was finally executed with a lethal injection.
Think about the mechanics of that act. In an environment designed entirely to strip away human dignity and reduce men to animals fighting for survival, Kolbe executed the original source code perfectly. Self-sacrifice, love for a stranger, nonviolent resistance to evil.
He lived it out to the very end.
When you look at the horrors of the Inquisition on one side and Maximilian Kolbe in Auschwitz on the other, the source material is fundamentally asking us to decide which of these is a deviation and which is the design.
And the text does not leave that question ambiguous. It explicitly claims that figures like Kolbe and Teresa of Calcutta are not exceptions.
Yeah.
No, they are, according to the notes, Christianity lived authentically. They are the standard functioning exactly as the founder intended.
We have covered an immense amount of ground here, navigating through 2,000 years of history, philosophy, and human psychology. Let's pull all of these threads together for you, the listener. We started this deep dive with a heavy accusation that Christianity causes violence and that the church has blood on its hands.
Right. And we examined how the text approaches this by first identifying the original, radically nonviolent commands of Christ to love enemies and put away the sword. We saw how the first 300 years of early Christians lived this out through martyrdom rather than conquest, defying the Roman Empire with nonviolent witness.
We looked at the central argument that when followers commit unjust violence, it is a complete betrayal of those teachings. We navigated the historical realities of the Crusades and the Inquisition, exploring the deep geopolitical, economic, and legal mechanisms at play, acknowledging the messiness of history without excusing the abuses.
We explored the modern boundaries set by the Catechism, which strictly limits violence and prioritizes peace. And we contextualized this by analyzing the horrific atheistic violence of the 20th century regimes, which the text uses to prove that violence is a universal human problem, rooted entirely in the human heart.
And finally, we looked at the positive fruits of authentic belief. The hospitals, the charities, and individuals like Teresa of Calcutta and Maximilian Kolbe, who represent the standard, live to its fullest, most radically loving potential.
Which brings us to the text's final call to action, its ultimate answer to the question of Christianity and violence. The Catholic answer provided by the text is this: Christ commanded love, not violence. Human beings are capable of both great good and staggering evil.
Right.
The religion clearly diagnoses this reality. Therefore, when Christians fail to live a life of peace and love, it does not invalidate the teaching. Rather, it confirms humanity's desperate need for the very moral transformation that Christ came to bring.
It is not a defense of the violence. It's a diagnosis of humanity. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over on your own. If a standard of radical love and nonviolence is so incredibly difficult to uphold that even the massive institutions founded upon it repeatedly fail to live up to it throughout history, what does that say about us?
It's a tough question.
Is the standard itself simply too impossibly high for our biology and our nature? Or is it exactly the unyielding mirror we need to force us to confront our own inherent flaws? We will leave you to think about that.
Thank you for joining us as we unpack this incredible source material.
Yes, thank you for coming on this deep dive with us today. We will be right back here next time, ready to explore another fascinating set of ideas. Until then, take care.